to read about her book. So Gin Patrol on the Purple Line is a novel by Deepa Anappara, published in 2020. Her debut novel it received wide praise and won the Lucy Cavendish College Fiction Prize in 2019. Gin Patrol is shortlisted for the 2020 JCB Prize and was longlisted for the 2020 Women's Prize of Fiction. The novel won the 2021 Edgar Award for Best Novel. Deepa, I can't actually see your face here for some reason. Just give me a second. There we go. Now I can see you. So congratulations on all the awards. I wanted to ask you, this is your first published novel. So why was this a story that you had to tell as your first story?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. Regarding the novel, it is my first published novel, but I wrote novels before, which weren't published, which were sort of just stayed on my laptop. And this is a story that I first thought I would write about as nonfiction, because I used to work as a journalist in India, and I used to write on education. So I would interview children living in impoverished neighborhoods like the one in my novel. And this is where I first heard about the disappearances of children, which are unfortunately very commonplace in India, especially in neighborhoods like these, because people don't really care about, what happens to those who don't have money and those, who don't have power. So it becomes very easy for the police and politicians to ignore the reality in those neighborhoods. So I would, hear about places where 20 or 30 children had gone missing over 2 or 3 years. And that's, it's a sort of unimaginable number. For the whole country, the figure is something like 180 children disappear each day. The figure could be higher or lower, because often policemen don't take these complaints seriously. They don't register a case. So we actually have no way of knowing how many children go missing. So I was, because I used to talk to the children so often, and I was really interested in their stories and how they understood, these disappearances, because it's quite a horrific thing to live through. And my interest was in finding out, how did children understand it? How did they get up and go to school every day, or play in the alleys, because they live in very small houses. They have to play on the streets outside. I was just wondering, how did they go about doing that, knowing they're living under this cloud of kidnappings and abductions, and they don't really know what could happen to themselves. So I thought I would write the story as nonfiction, by conducting these interviews with children. But there's a whole lot of difficulty in interviewing children, because they're not always honest, and they're often not interested in talking for long periods of time about anything. So I didn't really get around to actually properly working on that story. But it sort of stayed with me. And when I moved away from India, I stopped being a journalist. But this is a story that had stayed with me for several years. So I think I thought about writing it as fiction for almost 7 or 8 years before I actually got around to doing it, because for me, because I witnessed what really happens in these neighborhoods, and I'd spoken to parents who had lost their children. And so conveying that complexity while also sort of balancing the demands of storytelling. And there's all sorts of ethical dilemmas about writing about a vulnerable community. So it was very difficult for me to figure a way out on how to do that. So so I thought about it for a long period of time. And the fact that I think it stayed with me for so long, I think it told me that this is something that I really wanted to explore and examine more. So I think that's sort of a very long answer to your question as to why
it's perfect.
It's something that, I was thinking about quite a lot. And often, my way of finding answers when I was a journalist was through interviewing people, and as a fiction writer, I try to do that by inhabiting the lives of these characters.
Very cool. Okay. I was interested in the title. I have my understanding of what a jinn is. I was just curious what your understanding is and kind of where this title came from.
Yeah, so jinns are spirits, and it's people believe in them in India and the Middle East. It's quite common. So the Americanized version of the jinn is the genie, and Hollywood has popularized it
Mm.
as the genie. And the genie is a much more benevolent creature in many ways, and sort of often offering sort of comedic moments in film and television. But in India, the jinn is, especially in the north, jinns are worshipped and they're feared, and they're meant to have the ability to possess one's soul. And typically there are jinns are meant to be quite bad, which is why Jay, who is the main narrator of the story, a 9-year-old boy, and his friends, Pari and Faiz, they think that jinns could have kidnapped these children, because that's a sort of thing a jinn would do. But there are also good jinns, and so one of the stories, mythical stories in the book, is about a real place in Delhi where I fictionalized that place, but it is based on a real ruin where people go to pray to jinns, and they leave letters for jinns saying, please let me get good marks in an exam, or let me get this job. And the belief is that the jinns will read the letters overnight and answer their prayers. So the jinn in the title comes from, from the spirits whom the children believe could be responsible for these abductions that are happening in their neighborhood. And Jinn
So
Patrol,
are jinns previously living people?
they're actually meant to be spirits
Like a
created
spirit?
by God, by Allah. I mean,
Okay.
specifically, it is believed that they're created from smokeless fire. So Allah has this ability to create or shape these jinns from this. I don't know how the fire, but the fire is described as smokeless. So that is the religious belief. And I'm not sure, but a lot of it's very common in Arabic literature. You would find a lot of references, and also from South Asian literature. I've seen stories about the jinn from Pakistan, as well as other parts like Bangladesh, neighboring countries of India.
Right.
So yeah.
That's
And
interesting.
sorry, yeah, go on.
No, I was just saying that's interesting.
Yeah, and Jim Patrol, because Jay watches all these shows which have petrol in their names, like Police Patrol, which are essentially reality cop shows, which are hugely popular, like they're popular everywhere in the world. India has its own versions where they recreate crime scenes, and um, they show the police solving a particular crime. And Jay is a fan of those shows. So yeah, the Purple Line, I think a lot of readers have asked me why the Purple Line and what's the significance. So it is a metro line which runs near Jay's neighborhood, and the metro, or the subway, as you would call it in the States, it would represent progress, because the Indian railways, which connect cities, is sort of old and crumbling. It was old and crumbling at one point, whereas the metros are quite progressive. They're very fast trains, they're very clean, and also quite expensive, so out of the reach of people like Jay. So Jay's father had actually worked as a laborer on this line, but then he doesn't have the money to actually take the train every day. So for me, it was a metaphorical symbol of what's happening in India. You have these signs of huge progress, but also just right next to that, there are these neighborhoods where people can't afford to travel on that train line. So I felt, for me, in many ways, it was a metaphor for what the story is actually about.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. So from reading your book, I learned that there are about 180 children that go missing daily in India. And in your book, Varun Kumar confesses to abducting the kids in the story. What does he represent for you in the real world? In your opinion, could one kingpin be responsible for all the missing children in India?
I think it is I do think the book sort of doesn't give a definitive answer. And part of the reason for that is because that is how it is in real life. With these abductions, often, it's often the police are able to, in the cases, in instances where they've been able to solve these cases of kidnappings, they can often find, say, one gang of criminals who worked in one particular neighborhood, which is essentially what's replicated in the book as well. But I think the novel does speak to the larger issues which are there, the reasons why these kidnappings happen. And obviously that has its roots in poverty, which, Indian society has been looking away from those problems, and ineffective governance and corruption. So all those are the reasons why uh, kidnappings happen. So it's not just one person doing it for a particular reason or out of particular motivation. There are often multiple factors behind why something like this happens. So if there is a trafficking group of men, or usually typically men and women, who are responsible for trafficking, then part of the reason they're doing that is because there are no jobs, or because the legal system has failed. The police have not caught them, or if they've been caught, they've been um, allowed to let go without any sort of fine or imprisonment, because the legal system is not strong enough. So
Right.
hopefully, I hope that comes through, that there are all these multiple reasons why it's happening. And obviously it is not down to one person.
Yeah, it definitely did not feel like a happy ending. It didn't feel like things were resolved. Um, so yeah, it felt like it was a complex issue. I just kind of wanted to hear what your thoughts were on that. Okay, so I have another question for you. The message of the story for me was that in India, perhaps I say we because I'm Indian. So I maybe are too busy playing the blame game. So we blame Muslims for the missing Hindus. We blame Hindus for the missing Muslims. Um, the girls for being too ambitious and risking their safety. And maybe we're missing the obvious villains like the Varun Kumars that are dividing and conquering. And is that kind of how you feel?
Definitely in India today, particularly because currently we have a government that's come to power with, by talking about, by pushing divisive policies in many ways. And it's very common to see anything being blamed on minority communities. So when the pandemic started last year, for instance, the blame was instantly placed on Muslims. And I mean, it's hard to imagine how that's possible, but that's literally what happened. And, there's sort of, because the media is not able to question the government in ways it could before, because this government is very dictatorial in many ways. The media was pushing that story that a pandemic has spread because of a minority community. So what's happening in the novel is just a reflection of what's happening in Indian society, that there is a tendency to blame the minority community. And I would say that it's not particular to India in any way, because I'm an immigrant in the UK, and I find that anything goes wrong, then people like me are blamed for, I don't know, for everything. So it's very easy to, I think, easy for people, rather than look inwards and figure out where is the problem, what is the problem within yourself. It's very easy to blame someone else. And so I guess it's not something that's very particular to India in any way. It's just that the past few years, because there's a government that's been pushing it as a policy, this discrimination towards Muslims, it's all become much more overt than it was in previous years. And yeah, so this is what's happening. We should be thinking about, for instance, the economy, or India had a terrible second wave where so many people lost their lives and the economy has been completely sort of decimated. And instead the focus is always on uh, not on the real issues, it's just on minority communities, or yeah, all these other subjects which actually they don't matter at all in any way, but somehow they become the center of the attention. But I think you're seeing that, across the world.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, I'm going to let Rita Gupta, she's got a question live. If you could unmute.
Hi, Deepa. I just read your novel and I really enjoyed it. I loved how you narrated it from the children's perspective. I thought that was really interesting and very entertaining, like all the little phrases like tata bye bye, and how, for Jay, he's referring to everyone by their nicknames like Drunkard Lalu and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to say I really, really enjoyed that. My question was, I know at the end, you're giving kind of an explanation that these kids got taken by Varun, but we're not 100% sure, right? So I want to know that for each of the missing kids, did you kind of, when you started writing the book, have an idea that this is what I think happened to each of them?
Yeah, thanks for your kind words, first of all. For me, when I was writing the novel, I felt a great sense of responsibility towards these characters. I know they're fictional characters, but these incidents are very real. It's something that, so many Indians live with every day. And this is something, we went back and forth on during the editing process, because readers want a neatly tied ending, or at least that's what I was told. And I sort of resisted that because that's not how it works for most people. You don't get an answer. There are so many parents who are still living, who still don't know where their children are. And there are parents who go from town to town, city to city with a photo of their kid, asking people on the street, have you seen them? And I did feel that sense of responsibility that, often in almost all these cases, parents never know what's actually happened. So more than half of the cases, in fact, a majority of cases of missing children are not solved. And no one really knows what happens. And I felt that I had that responsibility to be true to that situation, which is very complicated. You don't really understand all the layers. No one can really see through the multiple layers of corruption, because it's not just one person, who is like this poor man living in the slums who is responsible. It could be just him, but it could also be, his actions may have been facilitated by the police and by the government and, by corrupt politicians, which is often the case in India. And I really wanted to convey that. And so I think with, right from the beginning of writing the story, I don't write with the plan and with a spreadsheet, and I don't know how things go. I'm learning what's happening at the same time as the characters. That's the only way for me to write. But I think what I was trying to do was to sort of convey that situation, because I think it would have been really different if I'd approached it purely as fiction without having met the people who had lived through these experiences, because I think then I would have found it easier to make it neater and give proper answers. But once you've seen that, it's very hard to, just focus on storytelling and render it without all the complexities. I think I read an article about trauma and writing trauma, representing trauma in fiction. And that person had said the same thing, that, trauma is sort of, you can turn that into a thriller only if you have not experienced it. If you have actually gone through trauma, that is not how you see it at all. It's not something that's a page turning exercise for a reader. So once that experience that I had as a journalist, and having, spoken to children, spoken to parents, and having interviewed so many parents who had lost their children, for instance, to religious violence, I wanted to write a story that conveyed all those sorts of complexities. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, but
I think you're saying that you didn't really kind of go into it with a vision of what happened to each individual child, even though you don't tell us explicitly what happens.
I think I had a rough idea in my head as to
Okay.
what would have happened from, just from having seen these cases and having read about them. But it wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to communicate in the book, because that is not the experience of parents. Parents don't often know what exactly, you don't get that sort of, I think you want that closure where you know exactly what happened, but parents often don't have that closure. And I wanted to replicate that in the book.
So in your mind, which ones did get taken by Varun and which ones didn't? Just out of curiosity, I know you don't have to answer that question. I'm curious.
No, it's just, I don't think I could answer that actually.
Okay.
It wasn't sort of, yeah, that's not how it worked in my mind. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was just kind of trying to get at, like kind of what was happening in your mind when you were writing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's okay. Thanks.
Okay, Deepa. So I've got another bunch of questions here. Why did you choose to, you kind of talked about this, but why did you choose to tell the story from Jay's point of view and why not an adult?
Yeah, so it was, for me, the question was really, how did children understand the disappearances? And I think part of that came from the fact that, the children's disappearances, because they were from poor neighborhoods, they were not part of the mainstream discourse in India at all. And so the children themselves, they didn't even appear as names. So often they're just numbers. And so you didn't know who these kids were who were going missing. And secondly, even when, say the police claimed that a case was solved, often the attention was completely on the perpetrators because the interest is in the people who committed the crime and what motivated them. And, it's almost a sort of prurient kind of salacious interest in their motivations and actions. And I felt that the children's voices were not being heard at all. So I really wanted the story in this novel, at least, to center their stories and their experiences. And the best way to do that for me was to write from, a child's point of view. And, Jay is representative of many of the children that I'd met in these neighborhoods because, I think you have a certain idea of what a victim would look like. And these children would not, they don't fit those sorts of ideas that someone might go in there with, because they have a lot of self-respect, they have a lot of swagger, and they're just trying to get through the day, have fun, and that's what their focus is on. And there's a lot of, they're quite funny, and they would roll their eyes at me if they didn't like the questions that I asked. And I wanted to and so he is essentially representative of the kind of kids that I've met. And so people often, I've had a few readers tell me, why is his voice like that? Because he's got a jaunty tone, and he tries to be funny. And it's almost like you have this certain idea of how a victim's voice should be, like it should be melodramatic, or it should be sad, or you should sound sort of, there's a certain expectation that a child who's poor will sound a certain way, and children don't fit into those sorts of ideas that adults may have. And so I think I wanted to convey that through his voice.
Thank you. So are missing children your life's work? Are there other issues that you wish to create awareness for now that you've become a known author?
So when I was working as a journalist, I did write about a number of issues, including sort of religious violence, which is, such a huge problem in India, because there's that attempt by various politicians to turn people against each other, in the name of religion or caste. So these are all subjects that have sort of explored as a journalist. And I think my interest is in, my fiction is also sort of driven by that kind of political imperative. And I think, because of where I'm from, the kind of person I am, I don't think it's possible to, write anything solely with the idea of just entertaining, I think, even though I think it is a good aim. And I do, books can't be polemical in any way. And I think fiction sort of fails if it's just meant to work as a polemic. But definitely I'm hoping, I think anything that I write will have some sort of, it will be around a social issue or something to do with human rights, which is sort of, work. Yeah, that is what I'd written as a journalist.
Okay. All right, I have some questions that were submitted about your writing process. So I feel like we've answered this one, but how did your past experience as a reporter help you write this novel?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of journalists, when they write novels, they say that the discipline really helped, and having to write to a deadline, they found that really useful. But for me, it was just like sort of the opposite, because it's so addicted to facts in many ways that I found it very difficult to move away from that to a fiction world. So I had to sort of know, my research was quite intensive, and then I would become obsessed with sort of making sure that the road is right here and like in the right place in the map, and often that doesn't translate to fiction well, which is part of the reason why the book is set in a fictional city. So it doesn't really, it's based on
We're not
real
fact
city.
checking.
Yeah, so I don't have to, I wanted to give myself that freedom. And I think, as I said already, that, but I do think that is a responsibility that even if you're a writer of fiction, you do have if you're writing about vulnerable communities, there is a responsibility. And I think people often say, oh, it's fiction, I can do what I want. And I don't really believe in that. I do think, if people from that community, they're not getting their books published and their words out, you do have a responsibility in how you're representing them. So that was definitely a determining factor in this book and how I wrote it. And I think my journalism background, it helped because, I had a really good idea of, how the children behaved, and so to recreate their voices and all that. Yeah.
Okay. As a debut novelist and an author of color writing in the West, what were the challenges that you faced in the process of getting Gin Patrol and the Purple Line published?
In terms of getting it published, I think because it won awards for novels in progress, the publication part was easier. I had books rejected before. As I said, this is my fourth book actually. So I had 3 books before which didn't go anywhere. But I think through the publication process and after publication, some of the things that have come up are questions about the Indian words, as people tell me, in the book, and how it was difficult for readers to engage with the book because there were so many terms which they didn't understand. And so I think there's that sort of, not without meaning to offend anyone, but the truth is that, I grew up like English is my 3rd or 4th language. And I grew up in a small village in Kerala, and I grew up in a time before the internet. And we were reading sort of, Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and I didn't understand most of the terms, about food. Like we wouldn't be seeing apple pies and ginger ale or any of that. But I didn't sort of question the writer for putting in those terms. At no point did it occur to me that these terms should be explained to me. So I do really think it's a question of, it's a political question. It's a question of power. It's the feeling that many Western readers, many white readers especially have, that, they shouldn't have to do any work and everything should be explained to them. And the decentering that takes place when you're reading about a different community, and that feeling of dislocation that happens when you read, for instance, a word in a language you don't know. People are very uncomfortable with it and unfamiliar with it. But, it didn't happen to me because I just thought that's how books are written. And because, that the position of power it's sort of, that axis is shifted towards the West. So it's okay if a Western writer does that, but not okay when a non-Western writer does that. So I think it's really made me think a lot about how readers approach fiction by writers of color, and which books by writers of color are received, for instance, well, or become popular. And often, I find that if there is, the situation is too complex in a novel, or if there's sort of languages or terms or cultural references that readers don't understand, there's definitely, sort of, there's a tendency to blame the writer rather than to think about, why do I feel this way? Yeah, so that's one of the things that have come up. It came up with my, with the publishing houses during the editing process as well. And in fact, the North American edition has a glossary, which is not something that I included, but which, you know, my publishers felt was very necessary for the book to reach the Western reader. Yeah.
Okay, so at its core, there is a mystery of a missing classmate, but this novel is so much more than a mystery. How did the idea for Gin Patrol unfold?
So I think when I started writing the book, all I knew was that I was writing, you know, a story of children disappearing from the children's point of view. So that's all I knew. And then I had these, when I was thinking about characters, I was thinking about the children that I had met. And so I knew that, you know, boys tend to be sort of overconfident because it is a very patriarchal society, which, you know, even if you're poor, you're privileged if you're a boy. So I knew that the boy would be an overconfident person, somewhat naive, but also sort of full of innocence and humor and cheer, like the children that I had met. And my experience with interviewing girls is that, you know, they were much more clearer about what was happening in the world. And in many ways, that's a function of that society, because, you know, you are forced to grow up really fast if you're a girl. And because, you know, it's not safe for you to walk outside even as a child. So, you know, you have all your antennas up from the time you're a kid, and, you know, you have a better understanding of the dangers. And so Pari is really reflective of, you know, most of the girls that I had met. And yeah, so when I started writing the novel, because reality shows are so popular in India, I felt that, you know, that's something that I could draw from. So yeah, it just started with with Jay, Pari, and Faiz, the three kids. And I knew that Jay watched a lot of cop shows, and then I felt that he would try to solve the crime. And really, then everything else sort of just came from his point of view and the point of view of the children, because, you know, that is the society that they live in. And so every day there are problems of class, caste, and religion. And, you know, you can't ignore that. You can't say, okay, today I'm not going to be dealing with any of those issues. And especially if you're living in an impoverished neighborhood and not a gated community, you can't keep the world out. So it's a part of daily lives, you know. And yeah, so all those, it was not, you know, people ask me if it was, whether it was an issue driven book. It was not at all. You know, it was really about the characters and how did they live in this world and how did they understand what was happening to them. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the end of my questions. Thank you so much for your time, Deepa. I really enjoyed your book, and best of luck with your future writing. I'm really looking forward to your next project.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me and for the great questions. And thanks to, you know, anyone who posted the questions for me as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.